So I left you with my mock-up and my dress form, and that's almost where I meet you again. I went on to cut out my fashion fabric and linen lining from the mock-up. I sewed together the back center seam, the side seams, and I lost all that footage because I was moving and my life was a mess. So that's why we meet again with the whole back panel of the dress already done. But I am going to take some time to show you how I transfer my pattern onto my pieces of fabric. So this piece is my my shoulder strap actually, and I'm just making the seam line a bit clearer here where I've drawn around my my mock-up piece. And I'm going to show you a method for marking up seam lines on both sides of two pieces of fabric at the same time. And it's very precise and very neat. It does take a bit of time and thread, but it's very much worth it. So what I've done here is I've taken the two shoulder strap pieces and I've just pinned them together. And we are going to start basting them together as well. I have no idea what this method is called in English, but directly translated from Norwegian, it would be something along the line of loop basting. And I've learned it from people who do original practice in Norway, so I think it should be at least historically plausible for the time and the place I'm trying to approach. And as you can see, I am just basting along with nice long stitches, but I'm not tightening the threads. I'm leaving a loop of thread, as you can see there, that I'm just not tightening it, and that loop is going to make all the difference in just a moment. So having basted all around, and now I have a lot of nice loops, I just remove the pins where I put those in, and we are now ready to start pulling these two pieces apart from each other. And you just gently pull so that all that excess thread is now in between the two pieces of fabric instead of on one side. Having separated the two pieces, we now need to cut the threads, and we need to do this very carefully because you don't want the little pieces of thread to run away from you, to be pulled out and disappear, and that can happen very easily. So yeah, take care. If you lose all your little threads, then that's all that work in vain and you have to start all over again. So I'm trying to cut as in the middle as possible so that you have the equal amount of thread on both sides. And when you get to the corners, don't pull on it too much, because then you'll pull it loose. Having carefully snipped all those little threads, you now have two pieces of fabric with a lot of little sort of fluffy thread ends that will not come into focus. Okay, this is... hang on. That's better. Okay, so now you can see the little ends that we've snipped off. So far this is a very perilous piece of fabric. The threads can disappear quite easily. We need to secure this. And we do that by basting again, but this time along the line of the stitches. And it's easiest to baste from the side that does not have the loose threads, I find. Having then basted all around, we can now start removing the snipped off little bits so that we don't get those in our proper seams when we start sewing the garment together, because that's not very nice, that's not very pretty. They've done their job, they've guided us, and they can go now, thank you. And the end result is a very precise basted seam line that is visible on both sides of the fabric, both on the right side and on the inside, and that is similar on both pieces. Brilliant. The center back and side seams, backside seams, are sewn using the English stitch. If you want to see how I do that, you can go to my stays video, I'll link that. And I've also made some boning channels along the backside. And this is what we've got so far. I am taking a lot of guidance from the American Duchess book of 18th century dressmaking, and they recommend that you first fit the back piece of your bodice onto the person who's going to be wearing it, and then you fit the front piece to the back pieces. Now, I have to fit on myself, and I think that would be almost impossible to do on yourself, but my dress form is made to my measurements, so it should do the trick. Especially if I baste it and then try it on myself after I've tried it on her. The only area where I'm not really following the American Duchess is when it comes to the sleeves. This is why I'm only fitting, I'm fitting the sleeves differently and the shoulder straps. This is only the shoulder strap linings, and I'm fitting those to the back of the gown, as they have already been basted to the front. And then the sides are fitted. Only the lining, again, is being pulled towards the back and just pinned in place with all the seam allowances on the outside. I think I found out that I needed a little less room in the chest area and a little more in the waist area, but that's something I won't sew down until I've tried it on my body and not just on the dress form. I also folded in the seam allowances on the back to get that sort of very characteristic pointed dip in the mid-back. I actually went in and redid this later because it turned out very square and I wanted a very pointy point. I basted the side seams after I'd made sure they actually fit me, and then folded all the all the seam allowances towards the front, and then whip stitched the lining into place. I'm actually catching all the layers here, one fashion fabric layer and 2 lining layers, to create that very smooth, very flat lining. And even though my stitches are coming up on the right side there, they are almost invisible because my thread is very closely matched to the colour of my fabric. This is a finished seam, and this is how it looks like on the outside, with all the seam allowances pressed forward. Now, the next thing I needed to do was to cover those seam allowances with the fashion fabric of my front. Now, I found it very helpful to pin the fashion fabric and the lining fabric together as I smoothed it backwards, just to keep the 2 bits from sort of sliding around and becoming irregular. And when I reached that side seam, I folded my seam allowance under. I made sure it covered all my raw edges and all my seams, and just pinned it in place. Having basted down that one as well, I went in and just sewed the fashion fabric of the front piece to the rest of the bodice, through the fashion layer on the back, or the side piece, and both of the lining layers. And I used a small and evenly spaced prick stitch. So this is what the seam looks like from the outside, and I don't know if you can see, but it's also pretty neat from the inside. Then came the job of hemming the sort of lower edge of the bodice. I did that in 2 different ways. For the back and side piece, I just folded up the hem and I sewed it in place with a very spaced out back stitch, as you can see here. This bit is going to have the skirt attached to it, so it won't really ever be visible. However, I did not choose this for the front pieces of the bodice. I will show you in a moment what I did for those. I thought that I might need something that would give a little more sort of hold and structure for the front part, especially for the point, so I used something that I'm used to calling a whip prick stitch, and it's basically a sort of mix between a prick stitch and a whip stitch, where you sew a whip stitch from the inside and a prick stitch from the outside. I'll show you in more detail. The needle goes over the edge of the lining, only through the fashion fabric, and then you make a small prick stitch on the fashion fabric side that goes through both the fashion fabric and the lining, and then you just repeat. Here in more of a close-up, you can see the needle goes in above the lining edge, but when you make the prick stitch from the fashion fabric side, that stitch goes through both the fashion fabric and the lining. And this is a great method, especially if one of your fabrics is prone to fraying, because it kind of controls that fraying as well as giving your edges a very clean and crisp look and a bit of support. So with the side seam and the hem at the bottom done, it was time to move on to the sleeves and the shoulder straps. This is still just a shoulder strap lining, and I'm just whip stitching that to the lining of the bodice where I fitted it earlier. Then came time for the sleeves, everyone's favourite part of every project, am I right? I chose to do my sleeves the way that the American Duchess Guide to 18th Century Dressmaking suggested for the 1780s Italian gown, which is placing the fashion fabric and the lining on top of each other, mirrored, and then sew the sleeve seam on both the lining and the fashion fabric at the same time. So I did that with just a plain old back stitch to give that extra flexibility and strength. I then cut away some of the seam allowance to avoid a very bulky sleeve seam. I took some time to decide what way I wanted my seam allowance to lay before I turned my sleeve, so that I had a lined sleeve with linen on the inside and cotton on the outside. And this is actually such a smart way of doing sleeves, lined sleeves, that I've started using it for modern garments as well. It's just so quick and so practical. So thank you, American Duchess, for teaching me this method. My sleeves have a little elbow dart that I've just marked out on the lining side, and that I then sewed down using a backstitch. A little pressure and a little bit of fingernail is all you need to make a dart in linen lie the way you want it to lie. So I just did that very quickly with my fingernails, as you can see, before I began to sort of drape the fashion fabric over the dart of the lining. And I did that by just sort of smoothing the fabric over the dart and pinning it in place. And then when I'd reached the sort of end of the dart, I smoothed the fabric the other way to create a dart in the fashion fabric as well. I then stitched the dart down using a prick stitch, and I made sure not to catch the linen lining, because that would make hemming the cuff a lot more difficult later. And here is the finished dart of the elbow. The sleeves have a small dart in the bend of the arm as well that I've marked out here on the fashion fabric side. And I made that just by folding the sort of lower end of or lower line up to meet the top line and pinning that in place. And then sew the entire pleat down again with prick stitches, but this time I caught all 4 layers, so 2 layers of fashion fabric, 2 layers of lining. The arm bend pleat done, looking nice both from the outside and the inside, I think. And having also finished the elbow darts of the lining and the fashion fabric, the sleeves now just needed hemming, and I used the same method as I did for the lower end of the bodice, the sort of whip prick stitch, to hem my sleeves as well. It was time to set the sleeves, and here I followed a different method, and I will link it down below because it was really helpful. I started by sewing the sleeves to the underarm of the bodice, from sort of shoulder strap to shoulder strap. I used a backstitch. The backstitch is very strong and it's also very flexible, so it's perfect for these sorts of jobs that need to take a bit of strain. And as you can see, the sort of lower end of the sleeve is attached, but the top, the shoulder, is left loose because that's fitted on the body. So I put my stays on, I put my bodice on with one sleeve, and I started to move around to see where I could fit my sleeve, where it would be best to fit it on the shoulder. I apologize in advance of my sort of acrobatics contortionist face. I also want to point out that yes, I have the worst habit of carrying a lot of pins in my mouth. It's not a good habit, and I'm trying to kick it, but I haven't been successful yet. So yeah, sorry about that. Don't be like me. Don't eat pins. It's a bad idea. And I mean, this step was interesting and fun, but it was quite a lot of work, and it's not very easy to fit on yourself, but I think this method made it easier. I'm just trying to sort of fold all my excess fabric backwards, because there is often a lot of wiggle room in 18th century sleeves, as far as I can tell, but all that extra volume is never sort of on the top of the shoulder, where I would want to put it for, say, a 1940s sleeve. It's always towards the back, so that's what I'm trying to do here, to push all that excess fabric towards the back. This was also when I realized that my sleeve was way too wide and needed tightening up a bit, because you're not supposed to have that much wiggle room this late in the century. So I've tightened up the sleeve just a little bit with some pins, and I like the fit of it much better now. I'd like to be able to move in it, but I don't need it to be baggy. And I like the pleats at my shoulders. I don't understand why. It seems like it's a bit too big in the bodice back here, but that might just be for now. Once I get like the skirts attached, they're probably going to be quite heavy, and that might straighten that out. Only problem is now that when I move the shoulder strap of the bodice up to where it should be, can you see the sleeve's too short? I got the elbow dart above my elbow. that's not where it's needed. So I think I'm going to let down the sleeve a little bit and see if that works better. Okay, after some acrobatics with pins, I think I like the fit, the length and the fit of the sleeve now. I am obviously going to lay down this back here, just a couple of pleats at the shoulder, and then yeah, I mean, it's kind of pulling, which is probably because the arm side, this being adapted from a modern pattern block, is a little low. I would have liked it up. Might not be able to show you. I would have liked it up here instead of down here, but it's, I mean, it's fine, it works. No big deal. There's not a lot of wrinkling when I carry my arms down. And I mean, there's always going to be wrinkling when you move. You can even see wrinkling in portraiture. So yeah, I think moving the arm down, oh sorry, the sleeve down a bit, taking it in a bit. Right, so all that remains now is to do the same thing on that arm. Otherwise it's going to be a very strange dress. Having pinned the sleeve in, both from the outside and from the inside, it was then time to sew it to the rest of the armhole, to the shoulder strap. And I did that by folding in the seam allowance of the shoulder strap and whip stitching the sleeve and the shoulder strap together. And I made sure to catch all the layers of all the fabrics so that I would keep the pleats, the sleeve pleats in place. Cutting away some of the seam allowance to avoid a lot of bulk on top of my shoulder. This was now the state of my sleeve, and it was time to think about getting the fashion fabric shoulder strap in. First, of course, you remember I narrowed that sleeve a bit? Yeah, almost forgot to do that to the other sleeve. That would have looked very weird. Luckily, I remembered it and was able to take it in before sewing it into the bodice. So this is how it looks like on the inside now, with the lining of the shoulder strap. But of course the seams are visible on the outside and we really want to cover those up, and that's what I'm going to use the shoulder strap for. So I'm just folding in the seam allowances, pinning those in place, and making sure I cover all the raw edges and all the stitching, but not attaching it to the lining for the last sort of couple of centimeters towards the neckline, because that will make the neckline very difficult to hem. So this is the long side of the shoulder strap, and you can see I'm just folding in the seam allowance, covering up everything that I want to cover up, and pinning in place. And then I sew the shoulder strap in place using a brick stitch, and I'm no longer very worried about catching all the pleats because they are already being held in place, so everything else now is just bonus. And I'm saving the sort of neck edge of the bodice till last, so that I can edge all of that in one sort of fell swoop instead of very piecemeal. And the only thing left to do now, with our sleeves in place and our shoulder straps in place, is to finish that first seam that we did, the underarm seam. And I did that by cutting the seam allowance and just folding one of the lining sides over to encase all the raw edges and hem stitching in place. I don't know if this was strictly necessary, but I like the insides of my garments to look neat, at least, if not nice. And with the sleeves all done, and I also went on and hemmed the neckline using the same whip prick stitch, the bodice is done and I could move on to the skirts. Now, I was originally planning to cut a lot of panels and sew them together. However, my fabric had the perfect width and that was just perfect for the length I wanted for my skirts. So I got away with just cutting one long piece of fabric and then hemming the sides. And does this reflect the period widths of the fabrics available in the late 18th century? No, it doesn't. But would an 18th century mantua maker have been very happy to not have to sew a lot of panels together if she could avoid it? Definitely. So I feel like, even though it's not period correct, it is definitely in keeping with the sort of spirit of the mantua maker. And with one of the selvages actually being so beautiful, I could use it as the hem of my skirt without having to hem it. All I had to do was to make two tiny little hems on each side of the front opening of the skirts, and the skirts were ready to be pleated. So, having gently pressed and ironed my bodice, I am just folding it out on my ironing board to find out how wide the skirts are going to be, what they need to be pleated down to. So I'm just marking with pins where I want my skirt edges to be, and that will give me a sort of guideline of where to measure. Then I brought my trusty quilter's ruler. I love working with this one. It's see-through and it just makes everything so much easier. So what I did is I lined it up with one of my pins and with the top of the sort of side seam curves, and to give me a straight line to measure across, I got a pencil and I marked a line, not just the sort of top line but also the corner where it goes down towards the pin marking the skirt edge. It's not very easy to see here, so it'll be easier to see now. I'm doing it on the other side. I'm just lining that ruler up with the line I've already made, and drawing onto the linen lining just a tiny sort of pencil line with a little corner, and then I can bring out my measuring tape and measure along that line how wide my skirts need to be. Removing my bodice, I am measuring up the skirt width onto my my ironing board. I should say though that I've padded out my ironing board quite a lot with blankets and covers, so it's quite a sturdy but also quite sort of thick surface to pin into, which is very useful when you need to do the kind of pinning that I'm doing here. Not because the fabric in itself is very heavy, it's a fairly lightweight cotton, but when you have this much of it, it will get heavy, so having a sturdy pinning surface is gonna make all the difference. So I just folded my measuring tape in two to find the middle between the 2 points, and I'll be marking that with a pin as well. The pin on the fabric marks the middle of the fabric, so I'm just matching those 2 pins up, and then I'll be matching the sides of the fabric to the 2 pins on either side. And the way I like to do this pleating is by folding the fabric in 2, then in 4, then in 8, then in, until I have the width of pleat that I want, that I'm looking for. And then I sort of divide up the surface that I'm pleating onto in the same increments. And this gives fairly nice and even pleats. Not that that mattered too much to people in the 18th century. A lot of extant garments have very irregular pleats. The pleating in itself into even knife pleats towards the back, the mid-back, took ages. But it's quite a nice thing to do though, because the end result looks very sort of neat and crisp and beautiful. Have you noticed, by the way, that I really like the word neat? Because I really do. When the pleats were all done, I went back and I pinned them again, just a little further down. This just makes for makes it easier to pin the bodice onto the pleats. And that's what I'm doing now. I'm finding the middle point for my middle point in the back, and lining up the side curves with the top edge of the skirts, and the pins with the side edge of the skirts. And as you can see, it's quite a lot of skirt pleated into not a lot of bodice, which is great. That's the look we're going for. That's exactly what these dresses were all about. And so I found that if I started by removing a few of the pins from the top, especially the middle of the skirts, and just sort of move those down to the bodice, it made it a lot easier to remove the bodice and the skirt from the ironing board when everything was pinned in place. And then I just started pinning. Every pleat is pinned to the bodice at least once, otherwise they might sort of dissolve and the end result won't be as good. With every pleat pinned to the bodice, I could remove everything from the ironing board, turn it around, and then to make the skirts lie flat and nicely downwards, I went in and I cut a slit up the middle back of the skirt. And as you'll see, it just makes everything lie a lot smoother and nicer, and it will even give my skirts a little bit more oomph, which is great. I attached the skirts to the bodice using what's called an applique stitch. This is also from the American Duchess book, and I made sure to catch every layer, all the pleats, so that they would lie nice and evenly. And the last thing I did was to attach some ribbons to the waistline and to the skirt. Oh, sorry, it's a cat there. So I could hoist it up. Working on a fairly big project like this dress is, while moving houses and starting to, becoming a student again in the middle of a pandemic, has been a challenge. But I feel like I've learned a lot, and I am fairly happy with the end result. And I was super happy when I got invited to a picnic in the botanical gardens, because what better place to show off my beautiful white and blue teacup gown.